Hello and welcome. Welcome to Addressing Anti-Blackness in Education, Developing Youth as Global Citizens. My name is Natasha Wilkins, and I am an attorney and education advocate with the National Center for Youth Law. Today, myself and some of my esteemed colleagues who you will meet during this webinar are joining you from New York, where we are attending the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. For press, this is an off-record event for learning on background. The speakers will be available for on-record interviews following the event. You can reach out to me at nwilkins@youthlaw.org to schedule an interview. So this session is not sponsored by the United Nations nor affiliated with the forum, but we do want to thank the UN for creating space for the International Decade of People of African Descent and for working to address the historical and present injustices faced by people of African descent around the world. In our conversation today, you will hear from highly acclaimed educators about the impact of anti-Blackness in education systems. We want to acknowledge that there is absolutely discrimination that is faced by other groups. But today, we are specifically focusing on anti-Black discrimination because it is unique in its manifestation and history, and also because this is a side session of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. We firmly believe that injustice for one is injustice for all, and we seek and support advocacy for justice for all people. So today's conversation is particularly timely as across the United States, over 600 policies have been proposed at the local, state, and federal levels that seek to prevent discussions on race and racism in classrooms. These censorship measures are accompanied by bans on books, largely by and about Black people and Black experiences. Most recently, we have seen the banning of The Hill We Climb, the poem written by Amanda Gorman, the youth poet laureate of President Biden's inauguration. This book was banned because one person in a school district complained that this poem about progress and hope hid messages of hate. And based on that one complaint, the book was deemed inappropriate for younger students and removed from access for them. As this demonstrates, this is not just an issue of erasure of Black history long ago, but there is a concerted political campaign to erase Black people also in the present. As we continue our conversation, we will hear about how educators are pushing back against these efforts to erase Black history and Black progress and excellence, and what can be done to create classrooms that affirm the identities of all students. But before I continue, I'm going to invite our panelists to introduce themselves, and we're going to hop right into that.
And I'm finishing my 25th year in education. In this time, I've taught English for 19 years, grades 7 through 12, and then moved into instructional coaching, supporting principals, teachers, superintendents. I write, design workshops, and keynote for various events around the country. And in 2014, I was named the Texas State Teacher of the Year. I was also named a Lowell Milken Fellow, and through that fellowship, I've worked with students to highlight the contributions of citizens around the world. I'm also a 2015 NEA Global Fellow, and in that fellowship, I work with other educators and students to study education across the country and around the world, and then design learning experiences for students to understand global citizenship. This year, I'm working with this amazing group of educators to advocate for students around the country. And then finally, in 2 weeks, I will receive the honor of being inducted into the National Teachers Hall of Fame. Thanks for having me.
And we'll go to TK.
You have to make me go after Chris and Monica. Hi, everyone. My name is Takeru. I also go by TK, and I'm the 2020 Massachusetts Teacher of the Year and the 2021 Horace Mann Award winner for teaching excellence. And I was a former English teacher in New Bedford, Massachusetts. I don't have as many accolades as Chris and Monica do, but I'm super excited to be here. Also happy API History Month, and then tomorrow's June, and so it's also Pride Month.
We'll pass it over to Tracy.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tracy Nance, and I'm an elementary educator. I've taught grades 2nd through 5th, as well as numerous student teachers. It brings so much joy to me, teaching others how to enter that space and treat all children as if the world is on fire and it is their time to shine and get all of the learning. I have a master's in urban education from the University of Chicago, and I'm the 2018 Atlanta Families Award for Excellence in Educator winner. I'm also the 2020 and 2021 Georgia Teacher of the Year, and I spend my days with this amazing crew looking at policy across this nation and how it is harming our kids, specifically our most vulnerable students. And I'm excited to be here with you and to learn from you and talk about what's important for our children. I'm going to pass it over to Gerardo.
So caught up in the stories of these amazing people I work with, I forgot I needed to speak. Hi, everybody. My name is Gerardo Munoz. Pronouns are he, him, él. Mostly I'm a Chicano from the east side here in Denver, Colorado. I am a graduate at Denver Public Schools. I taught 23 years in Denver Public Schools, middle school and high school history, as well as ethnic studies, Chicano studies, indigenous studies, and hip hop studies. I served as 2021 Colorado Teacher of the Year, the first Chicano identifying person to be named State Teacher of the Year in this land that used to be Mexico. I've been an iRise Fellow at the University of Denver, looking for innovative and interdisciplinary approaches to equity and anti-racism. I am the executive producer and co-host of the podcast Two Dope Teachers and a Mic, where we remix the conversation on race, power, and education every day. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Denver in the area of curriculum and instruction, where I am examining the experiences of Chicano educators who teach Chicano studies at the high school level. And I'm really excited to just be here with everybody. Wish I could be in NYC with you, but we're so excited to be here.
And so as you all can see, we have an amazing panel of educators who we are going to hear from today. And I am super, super excited for the conversation we're about to have. But before we dive in, I want to give a little more context as to the extent of anti-Black attacks in education. So this political campaign was created after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, events that catalyzed the movement for Black lives and led to the demand for visibility for the harms being perpetuated against Black people in the United States and across the world. Schools in the United States responded to this demand for visibility for Black people by implementing anti-racist curricula, which celebrated the diversity of all people. And that was great. And we celebrated that moment. There was more to be done, but that was a step forward. This racialized and radicalized campaign that we see now, the anti-CRT campaign, is backlash to the progress that we saw in education. And it threatens not only the ability of every child to be valued in classrooms, but also threatens to push back the civil rights protections that have been established over the last 60 years, and even contravenes international human rights protections, which we are at the UN right now talking about. So with that context, my first question is for Chris. So Chris, can you speak a little bit to how widespread these attacks on honest, truthful history are, and why this conversation should also be discussed from a human rights perspective?
That's a great starting question, Natasha. And as a current history teacher and history professor, this is meaningful to me on both a professional level and a personal level. To address your first point, the first point of your question, I'd like to orient us on what's transpiring in the U.S. by shedding light on this statewide censorship and its connection to the erasure of African history. As you mentioned, over 600 policies have been attempted to pass by legislators or have passed. And at least 18 states in the U.S. have passed measures to censor discussions about race in schools. And this obviously has raised concerns about freedom of information, the preservation of historical truth, among many other issues. And what makes this pattern more unsettling is the fact that 10 of these states historically allowed the legal ownership and enslavement of Black people. If we can we take a moment to visualize this overlap to see a significant correlation between states that practiced slavery in 1860 and those that have enacted censorship measures? It's pretty telling. Fortunately, in Louisiana, we managed to thwart the passage of this type of legislation. Nonetheless, this pattern inevitably raises questions about the intentions and implications behind legislative actions to suppress African history, African American history. And in some places, as we've seen in recent months, educators who violate these censorship measures can face severe consequences, ranging from losing their jobs or being fined or prosecuted. We're seeing an increase in that. So this not only suppresses academic freedom, but also impedes on the dissemination of accurate and inclusive historical narratives that should be reflective of all students. To continue on that, these measures are also problematic because our understanding of the U.S.'s complex history is incomplete without addressing the impact of African history and the vast contribution of African Americans. Slavery, segregation, and mass incarceration all play a significant role in shaping our nation, as do resistance and liberation movements. And in many countries, this economic prosperity that we see in some countries around the globe today are deeply intertwined with the exploitation of Africans and their descendants. So the repercussions of this history continue to impact our society, which means it's crucial to address these historical injustices and their impacts today. And the best place to do that is in the classroom, in a history class. But we can't build students into global citizens if we aren't truly embedding African history, which is a global history, into our curriculum. And to continue on that, it's important to recognize that this erasure of Black people from history is not solely an issue in the US. The history of African people extends beyond our borders and well beyond Africa. The transatlantic slave trade, imperialism, neocolonialism, as well as Pan-African and African-led liberation movements, all of this interconnects Africa, Europe, and the Americas. So understanding these international dimensions allow students to grasp the global significance of these narratives, these interconnected narratives, which is essential in building students into global citizens. However, despite these vast global connections, places like the US and the UK are attempting to pass measures to censor or whitewash history. And schools throughout Europe still distort history. When I taught world history, I had my students read excerpts from Portuguese textbooks and other European textbooks to analyze how these countries teach the transatlantic slave trade. And we would contrast that with actual primary source documents. And of course, the contents of these textbooks they consist of what many of you probably already know. The second point to your question regarding the human rights component of this phenomenon, well, giving justice to African history isn't something that we think should be done because we are history teachers or educators who seem to care, but it also coincides with the committed goals of the UN. So if we can go to the next slide, I have a quote from Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that, quote, education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality. And I also pulled from, if we can go to the next slide, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which was adopted by the UN in 2001. Quote, we recognize that education at all levels and ages, in particular, human rights education, is a key to changing attitudes and behaviors based on racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and to promote intolerance and respect for diversity in societies. In essence, states around the globe have a moral obligation to ensure that education is honest and holistic. So if countries are denying students access to historical knowledge, then that's going to hinder on students' ability to become fully informed global citizens capable of critical thinking, compassion, and empathy. Additionally, Article 2 of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide defines genocide as, quote, the mental harm to members of the group, end quote. So denying people their history most certainly constitutes as mental harm. So when people in positions of power seek to create a false narrative that minimizes or essentially erases the history, the resistance, liberation movements, or accomplishments of a specific group of people. It is a gross violation of human rights, as described by the UN, that has dire consequences. I want to end by not being too pessimistic, because we have seen examples of countries attempting to rectify their history, to move forward toward healing and reconciliation. Germany, Rwanda, and South Africa, while far from perfect, of course, they are examples of educational systems that are at least confronting egregious historical injustices that happened in those countries. To conclude, schools should be places where states teach history based on truth. And when a historical narrative is distorted or censored, it threatens progress and violates a kid's basic human rights. So in education, we must recognize the importance of an honest and comprehensive education to build global citizens. And only by addressing historical injustices can we actually work towards building a global society that values the inherent dignity and worth of every student, which is why I'm so glad to work with all of you who engage in this struggle, because at the end of the day, it's a student's right, and which is why this struggle is a human rights struggle above all, which is why it's so worth fighting for.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Chris. And for those who are listening in, we do have the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. And so we will take questions at the end of our conversation. If you have any at any point in time, feel free to drop them there in the Q&A, and we will answer them to the best of our ability at the end of our conversation. And so with that, when we talk about human rights, like Chris just mentioned, it includes the freedom of opinion and expression. We talk about the rights that are inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. And that is exactly what is being attacked, with systems of education being the vehicle for those attacks at this time. And so my next question is for Takeru. And as you come on screen, TK, can you share why we need to specifically talk about anti-Blackness in education when we think about building youth as global citizens?
Yeah, of course. And I'll not just talk about why, but also how. And I'll start off by sharing how not to talk about anti-Blackness with our students, and through an example of my own classroom. I think that, even if you're well-intentioned, one of the traps that educators fall into, especially when we're telling stories about ourselves, our students, our school communities, is this trap of teaching through deficit and teaching through despair. We're so troubled by the inequality, the inequity that exists, so incensed by the injustice, that in trying to highlight the experiences of marginalized groups, we end up repeating single stories of their plight and their destitution. In other words, there are these stories that elicit ire and sympathy in the short term, but those that are unintentionally stigmatizing these groups by defining them by what they lack and not what they have. And to that I say, outrage, it's good at garnering attention, but it doesn't really inspire any change. And so back to my story, a few years ago, one of my students, Yasmin, she was in my classroom, and she was just so pissed off. She was complaining about my text selection. And she said out loud that my texts depressed her about Black people, right? And at the time we were, I think, unpacking the Baltimore protests. And even though my intention was to highlight the inequalities that exist along racial and class lines, and that's why these protests are coming to the foreground, the emotional message that Yasmin was inferring through my text and my lesson that day was that Black people exist in the US to be oppressed, to be marginalized, to be discriminated against. And the broader context, right, especially at the time with some of the things that I was teaching, the lessons that I had, I was reading texts like The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And for those of you who don't know, that's a text that vividly depicts the violence that Black people had to endure in the 1950s. We would also do a lot of deep dives into data, looking at disparities in wealth among racial groups, how they were tied to policies like redlining, the school to prison pipeline. And even in lessons or texts that weren't explicitly focused on race or Black people, for instance, of Mice and Men, right? I had kept teaching through this narrow gaze of destitution. And again, for those of you who don't know Mice and Men, there's a character named Crooks. He's the only African-American character in the text, and his essential function, right, symbolically, is to represent the isolation that comes from racist discrimination. And so in other words, what I was doing, and I talk about this a lot when I talk about LGBTQ plus people and their narratives as well, is that I was painting with one color, not with all colors of the rainbow, right? Painting with one color, not with all colors of the rainbow. And by essentially focusing on stories of destitution, I was tokenizing the Black experience in the same manner that many non-African countries do when they think about, when they talk about, and when they teach about Black people. And so to paint with all colors of the rainbow, right, that means we have to highlight the resilience, right, the strength that comes through their hardship, the joy, the magic, the beauty that thrives in their communities, the profound wisdom and contributions that they've made to our world and our understanding of humanity. And so when we talk about anti-Blackness in education, right, we can examine the dark corners, and I think we should, right? But we also have to equally, if not more, highlight the bright spots, explore how these groups and their history shined despite the challenges, how they sought solution that lit and changed the world. And it's by this fullness of humanity that we recognize this full scope and this hope for people that we affirm that I think helps connect to that sense of global citizenry for our youths. And so that moment for me with Yasmin, right, was a revelation. It shifted my own pedagogy. I still taught the same lessons in text afterwards, but the lens through which I looked at things shifted. And so, for instance, if I teach A Raisin in the Sun, right, by Lorraine Hansberry, it is not a story about housing discrimination towards a Black story, or it's not just a story about housing discrimination towards a Black family. It's a story about Black progress and hope in the United States and of a unapologetic resilience that is grounded in your love for family. And this idea, right, it goes all the ways in which we talk about and teach about groups of different people. And so even when I teach about, House of Mango Street, one of my favorite books, it's not a story about an 11-year-old Chicana who grows up in a low-income community and experiences trauma. It is a story about leaning into our family and our community in a time of hardship and being able to find your own creative expression in an unexpected place. And we just mentioned that we came back from the UN. And today at the UN session, there was one on Pan-Africanism. And many of the speakers were echoing this theme, that if we really want to achieve global citizenry, if we want to garner and develop a sense of collective identity, and of course, this was in the context of the UN session, and so they were explicitly talking about Pan-African identity. But they said, right, we have to reclaim and redefine marginalized groups beyond the lens of oppression. And one of the speakers, I'll paraphrase her name was Amara Enya, and she was just amazing at this session. And she said that when we talk about Blackness and people of African descent, we have to celebrate their resilience, their resourcefulness, their rhythm. We have to honor the power of Black ancestors, examine how they are continuing to support us all, right, regardless of your race and your background. And that we have to question the norms of those who appear to be winning, rather than presuming that the world that they've created is something that is desired or needs to be mimicked. And that last point really was like, for me, right? Like it totally resonated, because it's not just about teaching anti-Blackness by celebrating Black joy and abundance. It's also about questioning and also at times rejecting the culture, the systems, our culture, our systems that we navigate and sometimes benefit from, that have historically made Black joy and abundance so invisible to begin with. And because I could never top what Amara had said, I'll leave it at that. But that's what I think, what it means to have anti-Blackness in education.
Thank you so much for your thoughts and for capturing, what was a really powerful presentation by Amara TK. And so as we keep the conversation going, Gerardo, I'm going to invite you to join me on the screen. And TK just shared about the power of highlighting the full scope of Blackness in education, in our classrooms. Can you speak to how educators and advocates can use data to combat harmful stereotypes? TK talked a little bit about how he was using data in his classroom. So data can harm or it can help. So can you talk a little bit about how we can use data to combat harmful stereotypes that can impact how Black people globally are perceived?
I mean, I think so. I was my Mixtec and Otomi ancestors discovered the concept of zero, so I feel pretty good about numbers here. I really love what TK said, and it's been a big focus of my own research, is that we are more than our pain. And pain narratives tend to get a lot of attention and clickability and that kind of thing, but we are more than our pain. And so I really appreciate that. So in terms of when we look at data, one of the simplest places to look is demographic data. The demographics suggest something really powerful. So the African diaspora at last count is 170 million people across the world. These are people who live outside of the continent of Africa. So the numbers break down this way: 39 million in North America, 113 million in Latin America, which was always really interesting as a classroom teacher, because as a teacher of Chicano and Mexican American studies and even world history, we studied the enduring history of African descended people in Mexico. Over 80% of the people captured and forced into enslavement during those dark years first made port in Veracruz in Mexico, and then were sold and moved all over the Americas. So even in Mexican culture, we have a significant Black history. There are 14 million more members of the African diaspora in the Caribbean, 4 million in Europe. So, and if we look at 2023 census data, if the African diaspora was a nation of itself, and we can argue that in a way it is, right? It would be the 8th most populous nation in the world. And that's a piece that really sticks with me. Thinking about the universality of Blackness, right, and of Africanness. If the entirety of African descended peoples was a nation, it would be the most populous nation in the world. That shift is a really important thing. And I want to point out some of the work of my good friend and colleague, Dr. LeGarrette King, who's at the University of New York at Buffalo, I believe. He writes about Black historical consciousness. He writes that Black people represent the dawn of civilization, that people of African descent represent the emergence of nations, and that people of African descent will be here after these nations have fallen. It's a level of consciousness that is so important for all of us to remember. And this is something that is measured by data. And I love the comment in the chat that Black people are not a monolith. Absolutely not. But what is monolithic is anti-Blackness. It has no regard for the internal diversity of anybody, especially of people from African descent. It is unnuanced and is ignorant and it is violent. We as a nation of the world continue to subordinate people, Black people and people of African descent, as a minority. And even the numbers say that they are not a minority. We treat African people and Black people as a footnote, a divisive special interest, as a less than group of people, unworthy of the attention of our schools and our education systems. You know, and I get passionate about this, and I love the phrase, Mayra Rosa, thank you so much for that word, the global majority. We are the global majority. I keep thinking about this. We do this through policy and by minimizing Black history. We do this by minimizing Black art, Black politics, Black life, Black advocacy in educational spaces. And we fail to center the difficult and contentious historical event that resulted in the initiation of a diaspora. We cannot talk about the excellence of marginalized people without talking about the organized, systematized, and operationalized methods of violence and murder that happened. I want to bring this home to a couple of quick places. If we continue to relegate the 2 billion people that I'm describing right here to the shadows, we are all going to live in darkness, and it's going to happen soon. The implications are profound when we look at the disproportionality between Black students in the world and in the United States and the Black teachers that they have. 9 of our teachers are Black, where 15 to 17% of our students in our schools are Black. And this is a travesty. This cannot happen. When we remove this history, we remove the ability of nations of people to imagine their own futures. I get really worked up about this. It's obvious. And it's because as a Chicano from the east side of Denver, Black history raised me. I did not grow up around other Mexican American and Latinx people. That's not who I grew up around. I'm in one of the most segregated cities in the country. And if it had not been for the history, culture, vibrancy, that amazing fusion of cultural pride and advocacy that was modeled to me by Black communities in Denver, Colorado, I don't know where I'd be today. And so this is for all of us, but it is also really important to let the numbers speak for themselves so we can speak these numbers and we can speak liberation into existence. Thank you for listening. I will hand it back to Natasha.
Thank you so much, Gerardo, for your comments. And I'm just going to say you were in your zone as you were talking about those things. And so just a reminder for everyone who is listening in, we do have the question and answer function at the bottom. And so if you have questions, feel free to drop them in there and we will be taking questions at the end of our conversation. And so with that, my next question is for Monica. And so, Monica, we just heard from Gerardo how understanding the data empowers all of us. When we understand the data, we know how to make sure everyone is seen and make sure our students can see others. Can you talk about the practical steps educators can take to make the data real for kids? And how can we build truly global citizens who act locally and think globally?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Natasha. And I love it when Gerardo's in the zone. Like, I want that phrase on a t-shirt. Like, we are not our pain. It needs to be on a bumper sticker, it needs to be everywhere. So thank you to my colleagues who just spoke before me. If I may, I just want to start by grounding my response in a few truths. It's not an exaggeration to say that the curricula that is typically used in classrooms fails our children. I'll say it again. The curricula that we use with our students in our classrooms fails our children. In my own classroom, I was acutely aware of the fact that the scope of literature, as well as the grade level topics that I was supposed to teach, did not typically consist of perspectives or events that validated my students' identities or experiences. And so I had to do the work. I had to do the work to make my lessons more inclusive and culturally responsive. And both seminal and current research tells us that when educators work to fill in those gaps in their curriculum, students become critical thinkers who want to come to school, right? We improve attendance when students can see themselves in the curriculum. They contribute to the class community and they think about their own impact on society, on the local community, on the world. They learn to listen and respect others' perspectives, and they generally feel better about themselves. And is that not what we want all students to experience, right? However, what we continue to see is that the curricula at all grade levels fails to recognize the Black experience as a part of the complete American experience and a part of the global experience. And so this bias within instructional resources negatively impacts Black students who likely already feel marginalized within their school communities. And those of you who are familiar with the research of the Cooperative Children's Book Center may have seen these graphics that depict the lack of diversity in children's books. We see that although there has been some improvement over the past 10 years, the characters in children's books are overwhelmingly white. There are more books that depict animals and inanimate objects than there are books depicting the experiences of Black children. So you're more likely to find a book about a train or a truck than a book about a Black child, which makes no sense, right? And so New York University, NYU furthered this research, did a little bit of work, a lot of work last year, and they released a study towards the end of 2022 all about the level of cultural responsiveness or lack thereof in elementary English language arts curriculum. A team of educators and researchers worked together over several months, and they evaluated the largest textbook companies that produce materials for children grades kindergarten through fifth grade. And what they found is that the material used with children is either culturally destructive or culturally insufficient, right? So destructive, right? It's harming, it's causing harm to our children, or is culturally insufficient. They found that it lacks sufficient visual representations. So often they found that when there was a paragraph that was explaining something to children about a Black figure who was important to the country or important to the world, they didn't even put a picture beside it, right? The level of disrespect. They found also, and TK mentioned this earlier, that storytelling is often very one-sided, right? It's that depression, the downtrodden Black person. That is the only side of the story that most of the textbooks are portraying for our students. And Black people are depicted as always living hard lives, depressing lives. And there's not that balance, showing the normal joy, normal triumph. And what I also found just, even more egregious than there being a lack is that these textbooks were shown to be even demeaning to Black people or Black characters in general. So that is quite telling. And if you have not seen that research, I don't know if we have a way of sharing resources, but it is eye-opening. It is what we all know. But when they go textbook by textbook, page by page, it becomes even more clear that what we say is the great equalizer, right, which is education, is not, because the curriculum that we put in front of them lacks the equity that we know students deserve. And so with all of that, right, lots of bad stuff, what is it that educators can do, right? What is it that educators can do? I began to teach my students to look for these gaps. I remember teaching them, we were studying the 1920s, and when it came time for us to have a discussion, a hand went up and a student said, "Miss Washington, were there Black people in the 1920s? And I was taken aback by that question, like, of course there were Black people in the 1920s. But then I stopped and I took a look at what was present in all of what we had been given to study, right? So by our state, these are the things, these are the videos you can show. And I looked at them, and what I saw was they were depicting white lives, right? They were depicting white experiences. There were mostly white males being shown. There were white women being shown. And there weren't any Black characters or Black people shown in any of those videos. The books that we were told to read, the short stories that we were told to read, they were all about white experiences. And Black people were essentially, I think Myra mentioned this earlier, erased to the point that my students didn't even know we existed in the 1920s, right? So what can educators do? They can start by using that concept of windows and mirrors as a lens for all of their instructional planning. In case someone is not familiar with that metaphor, Rudine Sims Bishop, whose picture you see on the screen, she's a librarian and professor, and she often wrote about curriculum needing to provide students with opportunity to see themselves and their own experiences, those mirrors, as well as opportunities to learn about those things that they may not be familiar with, windows. She even expanded that metaphor by saying that students also need sliding glass doors, those opportunities to put themselves in the shoes of the characters they read about. And so it's important to think about where windows and mirrors are when instructors are planning their lessons for the week, for the unit. Where are those windows and mirrors? Is there a balance? Because so often Black children are forced to learn through windows only. Let us tell you about the other people. Let me tell you about the other places. And so what that essentially says is that your story does not matter. Who you are does not matter. Where you live is irrelevant. And so we're making sure that there is a balance there. And so educators must, on a regular basis, interrogate the curriculum. What perspectives are missing? How can you pull in more variety? And again, I said that I taught my students to help me look. They got really good at it. So I recommend that as well. We want to make sure that we are touching those things that are not a part of what we are being told that we have to teach. And letting students ask those questions, that's the best way to bring in those things that they know, that we know that they need to learn. And this one is super important. We have to build relationships with our students. Think about the assets and the interests that they bring to the classroom with them and plan around those, right? So not always thinking with a deficit mindset of what we have to help them do better, but what are they already good at and how can I plan around that? And so I think all of this work tells your Black students, any student in your classroom, that you see them, you hear them, you value them. And as a result, children begin to realize their own value. They will see themselves as a part of their immediate society and a part of the global society that we all live in. We are not just this one country sitting here. We are connected. And so the more we begin to help students to see that, the better they will be. So Natasha, when we do this work, and only when we do this work, will education begin to become the great equalizer that we often wrongly profess it to be. So thank you so much for that question.
And thank you, Monica, for your thoughts and your comments and your reflections and your sharing the story about what happened in your own classroom. I can relate to that, being a Black educator classroom before I became an attorney, and similar experiences as I sought to teach my Black students about Black history. And so I do want to acknowledge that even though this conversation is focused on the United States and on what is happening in the United States, this is a global conversation. The US is not the only nation that is failing to teach Black students their history. It is not the only nation that is erasing Black people from history. And so as we're thinking about the who, we also want to think about our students and the age of students. So right now, the conversation in the US is that it is not age appropriate to teach some students about these things, about racism, about race. And so Tracy, the last question goes to you. You are an elementary educator. And so we've heard a lot about why and how we can combat anti-Blackness in education, but can you speak to what students this kind of learning is appropriate for?
Gosh, I would love to, because this type of learning is appropriate for all students, even our very smallest kids, our youngest learners. The research has been really clear on this. And so that's why it's so confusing and concerning to educators that are doing this work of anti-racism in the classroom. The research is clear that by ages 3 and 4, children are very aware about the differences in skin color. And they're looking to the adults and what they say or what the adults are not saying. And that is where they're getting information. If we can teach about racism in an age-appropriate way and with an understanding of child development and how racial identity development occurs for young minds, we can combat this bias early on. I've always believed that the kids are the key to making this world a better place. That is exactly why I got involved in education and decided to pour into young minds, because they're the ones that are going to make the difference. And if we quit teaching them truth, if we ignore their own very real lived experiences, they will live in darkness. We will continue to live in this space where education is not the great equalizer, just as Monica said. The first school I taught at in Chicago was 100% African American. And though my students lived in the nation's third largest city, their own experiences and their understanding of history was limited to quite literally the 20 blocks surrounding them. Out of my class of 27 fifth graders that very first year, only 3 of them had visited Lake Michigan, a mere 20 blocks east of them. And that's appalling. I knew going in that they lacked an understanding of exactly where we were in our historical context, in the United States context, and that wasn't going to help them. I wanted them to be critical thinkers. I wanted them to see how powerful their roles were, how powerful their backgrounds were, and all of the possibilities for their own lives. And so we started digging into history by looking at all of the different groups that ended up living in this nation and really working on growing an appreciation for how global it actually is We looked at immigrants to Ellis Island. We looked at Native peoples. We looked at immigrants to Angel Island on the West Coast. We looked at the beauty of the food and culture and music that came across the ocean and that our children very much embraced, but had no idea of its roots. And that's a crime. At the end of that unit, I asked them what they wanted to name it. What should we name this unit that we all just designed together? And their words shocked me for a moment. They said, America the Beautiful. And I thought, is this everything that you've taken from it? And I asked them why. Is it because of a song that you've heard? And they said, no. It's because we realize that our history, our background, the way that we are all in this room together is beautiful. If we embrace kids' curiosities and we affirm their very lived experiences and introduce them to as many people and places across our globe, we're opening that door to possibility. In my master's program, there was a very specific focus on being honest and culturally responsive to our students. And this notion that if educators somehow ignore the world and the United States treatment of Black people, and if we ignore students' questions about race, that somehow they'll never know racism, that's patently false and it's criminal. The truth is, our Black children, our Black students do not get to choose when they learn about racism. They learn about it quite early on. And the studies show that it is the adults around them that create this. And if we lie to them, if we ignore them, that message is just as loud and clear that we don't care. And that could not be further from the truth for the educators, the people in this virtual room right now. And it is time that we start being very, very loud, because the world around us has jumped on to this anti-Blackness and they want to quiet it and they want to hush it. And we can't let our kids grow up in this kind of darkness. Our kids develop those race concepts very, very early on. And the idea that actually teaching about race and racism is what causes divisiveness amongst races, it's not true. In fact, Monica, if you'll show the slide, what studies show is that learning about ethnic studies actually increases academic engagement, credits earned, attendance, behavior, motivation, and that belief in self. Looking at developmental science, we know that our children move from concrete thinking to abstract thinking between the ages of 8 and 9. So at that point, they're drawing big conclusions from the experiences around them. You know, my Black students in Chicago and in Atlanta, they absolutely inquired about my own race every single year without fail. And they were amazed that I named my whiteness openly. We didn't always have the answers, and we didn't always agree on everything, but we learned to question. And in community, we learned difficult history standards. And we established the trust that's required for building an environment where kids of all backgrounds can thrive. And in truth, research shows that when we teach about racism, when we teach about prejudice, the result is decreased racism and prejudice amongst our students and even their families as well. And this stayed true in Atlanta public schools when I taught a very, very diverse group of students. What we must do is provide kids with books that have characters and histories that affirm all of their backgrounds, just like Monica said, those mirrors, those windows, and we want to expose them to the world. We want to push them to become global citizens. And we learned just last week that in the United States, global citizenry is another term that is now under attack. It's another term they don't want us to say. We're not going to listen. We're going to be loud. We are going to stand up for our kids. We are going to stand up for people of African descent around the globe. We cannot be quiet. There are several steps that look at the classroom. And what we actually realize is that the people that are trying to hush us those are the people that are living in fear. It is ignorance. That hate is bred by a lack of knowing. You see that slide? What is most important is that we grow kids who are actively anti-racist, and that we invite educators of all backgrounds to join in this, especially educators who are in the very skin that I'm in. And so to close up that question, Natasha, I think that it is imperative that educators look to be culturally responsive in the classroom, that we adopt anti-racist strategies by examining curriculum, by asking those questions, and by not being quiet, especially when it matters the most. And our kids, they matter. They are our future.
And thank you for those powerful comments, Tracy. And I do want to say that even though this conversation, and I invite all the panelists to join me back on screen, I do want to say, even though this conversation is largely, you're hearing from educators, we're talking about what educators can do, but this is not only what educators can do. All people can do these things, and we invite each and every one of you who are in this space with us today to be actively anti-racist with us. That can involve you lobbying or going to, if you are in a country where you have the ability to go and talk to those who make your laws, telling them what needs to happen. That can be things like you joining us in spaces like this, where we're talking about these things and where you're gaining education and going out and sharing that education with others and inviting others into these conversations. The more we refuse to be silent, the louder we get and the more progress we can achieve. And so again, I'm going to invite anyone who has questions to drop them in the Q&A. And our first question for any panelist who is here. We have the Vermont Teacher of the Year 2017. And the question is, she's now a state legislator and wondering if there is draft legislative language to shield educators in school districts that teach honest history. So what can folks who are in positions where they are in the seats of power, they can control legislation, what can they be doing?
I think Gerardo mentioned in the chat response that we have great resources. I'm not sure if we have any resources specific about legislative language, but there are a couple of communication tips that we've all been recommended to use. And so one of that, especially when it comes to this kind of work, is the importance of avoiding jargon, especially those that might be considered socioeconomically tense. There's a lot of research that supports that people are more likely to agree with you if you explain a concept rather than using these buzzwords, especially if we're communicating to a larger audience. And so, at the end of the day, as I think a legislator and a person in your own community, you know your audience the best. But even terms like equity, for instance, that like all of us in this space, I'm sure, have a very precise understanding and a very specific connotation towards. For the vast majority of folks, like the term equity is still associated with home equity and not in the ways in which we might think about it. And likewise, in another example, right, if you ask parents if they think schools should have culturally responsive pedagogy in schools, right, that means something to us, but to many parents who are not part of the education landscape, they might say no because they don't know what that is. But if you ask, should schools celebrate diversity and facilitate open conversations for students to discuss their experiences and perspectives, then a majority of folks will say yes. And again, that's because you're naming a concept explaining a concept rather than using these buzzwords and frames. The last thing I'll say is just the importance of universal values. I think when we're trying to communicate, especially to a larger stakeholder, there's a lot of emphasis on just the problem, right? We're really good at admiring the problem, problematizing things, and calling things out, which I think is important. But especially if we're speaking to a larger group, we want to focus on what our universal values are and what we all want. And again, one of the biggest learnings that I have through this fellowship is that when it comes to honest education, parents, family members, educators by and large, we all want the same thing, and that's for kids to reach their full potential. And so leaning in on and aligning around those universal values is, I think, a good way to go.
Yeah, thank you for that response, TK. The next question that I see, a question around these laws, and it says, does this mean that these laws, these policies that are anti-CRT, anti-honest education laws and policies, are they in violation of human rights under the United Nations? And if so, can the UN prosecute, investigate, enforce? And so I will take that being the attorney of the group. And so to that question, when we talk about human rights, really the grounding document when we talk about human rights is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you hear that, it doesn't say the Universal Law of Human Rights, it says the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so what that means is that document does not carry the weight of law. It is a declaration of what we aspire to see to be true for all people in the world. And so given that it is not a law, there are not structures and mechanisms in place to enforce those things. The UN does do investigations. The UN does provide recommendations. And in some cases, we see when there are deeply egregious violations of human rights laws and countries agree to allow the UN to come in and investigate and prosecute, we do see the United Nations leading prosecutions. But that requires the nation to agree to that. So where there is not that agreement, the United Nations does not hold that power. And so those documents don't carry the weight of law. And so again, this is why we need spaces like the Permanent Forum for people of African descent to have these conversations and to push for greater action to be taken. Okay. And in our last 2 minutes, I'm going to open the floor back to our panelists, seeing no more questions, and I didn't see any questions come in the chat. So our panelists, any last or final comments that any of you want to provide? Anything you didn't get to say that you want to share with those who joined us today?
I would love to say something, if that's okay. And I'll try to be sort of brief. I think we as a group, just in transparency, have really struggled with the way that the opposition to honest education, the opposition to this inclusive approach to education has just gotten louder and gotten so many policies passed. And it is frustrating and discouraging when we're out here trying to do this work. And we know that so many people like you are out here doing this work. But I was reading a piece that was published after a massacre that happened in the Lacandon jungle targeting the Zapatistas, the massacre at Acteal in 1997. And a few days after that massacre, local radio started putting the message out there, we are winning. And it wasn't sarcasm and it wasn't trolling. It was people reminding the people that we are winning. As long as they continue to come after us, it means we are winning. As long as we still draw breath and we still do this work and we're still able to find each other in spaces like this, we're winning. It doesn't feel like it. And it feels like that victory is going to be hard to attain. But I try to carry myself with that and be thinking about, we're winning, and this is why we're being targeted. So that's why I just wanted to share that. Just read that last night and feeling it right here.
And I don't think a better conclusion could have been presented. And so if you enjoyed this conversation today and you want to hear more from these wonderful, powerful educators, Tracy has dropped in the chat a link that you can use to reach out. This group of people, we do go around, we do share, we do come into other folks' spaces and provide this similar information to what we shared here today. We will also email that out to everyone who registered. And so please feel free to reach out. We would love to speak to your group and share more about how you can encourage anti-racism in your education space. And so with that, we thank you so much for joining us for our conversation today, addressing anti-Blackness and elevating youth as global citizens. We look forward to continuing the fight with you. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, y'all.